still looking into the events leading up to that miracle. Now, to set the stage once again, if you remember in chapter 10, at the end of chapter 10, Jesus was in Jerusalem. He was teaching. He was confronting his enemies. He was teaching them who he was. They then threatened to stone him. He confronted them once again, that they were stoning him for no good, legitimate reason. He wanted to know what good work that he had done that caused them to stone him. They said, "None, but you, being a man, have made yourself God." So then Jesus leaves that area with them trying to arrest him once again. He comes to the area where John the Baptist preached, in the Transjordan area, another little town called Bethany. And he simply was there to rest, but people kept coming and coming to him. Many came to him and believed. Those who had heard the preaching of John heard that Jesus was there. They went to hear Jesus, to listen to him, perhaps to perform miracles. We don't know. But they believed. So there was this wonderful ministry going on in the countryside of people coming to Jesus. And we looked last Sunday that this ministry was interrupted with a message from Bethany, another Bethany, towards Jerusalem, just 2 miles, less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. And the message was that his friend Lazarus was sick. His good friend, a friend that Jesus loved, was sick. Now this Bethany was less than 2 miles. I looked into that. 2 miles, an army can travel on foot in 2 miles in less than 20 minutes. If you've got some special forces, if you wanted to go after somebody with 2 miles away, you can get there probably in 15 minutes. So you get the idea of the danger that Jesus is putting himself in when he returns. Lazarus was part of a family that loved Jesus, and Jesus loved him and his 2 sisters, Martha and Mary. If you remember, he spent much time in that home as he ministered in the Jerusalem area. Now, when he gets the message, Jesus diagnoses the illness as one that will not end in death. But then later on, he tells his disciples that Lazarus is sleeping, and they said, "Oh, great, that means he's going to get better." And Jesus said, No, our friend Lazarus is dead. So he's trying to picture what's going through their minds here. Jesus said it's not going to end in death, but now he's dead. So all this was going through their minds, and Jesus said, "We're going back." And of course, that to the disciples, they felt to be suicide. We just escaped that area. They're going to get us. They're going to kill us. But Thomas said, if need be, we're willing to go with Jesus, even if it means death. So we see, even in their doubt, that there was faith there. So this faith that's going to be increased here as a result of this miracle. Then we looked into some of the lessons that in the scripture we covered last week. We looked into the human nature of the Lord Jesus Christ. So we're going to continue into that this week. We saw in that his affection for his friend Lazarus and for his family. So we knew there was a special bond there. There was an affectionate bond, a family bond between Jesus and this family. And we talked about the fact that Jesus was human. Not just that he got hungry like we do or got thirsty, but he had feelings and relationships just like we do. However, we also see him in his divine nature. He knew the state of Lazarus. He knew that Lazarus was dead. God had especially revealed that to him in his divine nature. And he also planned on raising him from the dead. So we see both the human nature of Christ and the divine nature of Christ. And we're going to pick up with that in verse 17. Jesus leaves the countryside, and then he comes to Bethany. Let's take a look at the scripture. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. So we find Jesus arrives in Bethany, and he's not surprised by this, but Lazarus is already dead and has been dead for 4 days. Now, J.C. Ryle talked about this section. He says, there is a grand simplicity about this passage, what we're going to look into, which is almost spoiled by any human exposition. To comment on it seems to be like gilding gold or painting lilies. He says that you could just read this, and the beauty is there, and the teaching is there, that you almost don't need to exposit it. But he does go on to say it's a good thing to do that, so we're not wasting our time here. But the passage is so beautiful. But it doesn't start that way. You start with a man who's in the tomb for 4 days. Now, we talked about last week that When the messenger was sent to Jesus, Lazarus had probably already died before he got to Jesus. Jesus then decides to spend 2 more days where he is, and then he takes a day in traveling back to Bethany. So we have this 4-day period. Now this sets the stage for his most spectacular miracle. Now 4 days in the tomb, when you think of that, this is when death reaches the point of finality. And it's hard for us. We've all been through losing loved ones and friends. It's hard for us for it to sink in that that person's actually gone. But for us, I believe, depending on the type of funeral that you have, and some don't even have a funeral in our culture today, but you're there. You look at the body in the casket. You get with friends and you talk about the deceased, and then when you get to the gravesite and you watch that body being lowered, then there's that finality there. Yes, they are gone. Now, in this case with the Jews, there was a certain finality. They reached a point in their culture. And F.F. Bruce talks about that. He discussed a belief among the rabbis that the dead person's soul revisited the tomb during the first 3 days, but left it permanently from the 4th onwards, when death was then irreversible. They had some idea that the soul kind of hovered around just in case the body was able to come back. But after the 4th day, the soul gave up. And that's where we are here. Now, John MacArthur, he has a sermon on this, and I listened to that. He goes into some rather gory details as what happens to the body in 4 days. I'm going to spare you that. I listened to it, and I think, you know what, I don't want to really get into that. But I want to just touch on it a little bit. The body begins to break down immediately after death. Now, unless you intervene with embalming or the body is cooled artificially, there's this corruption that sets in. Now, some of us on our driver's license may have underneath our name there, organ donor. Now, if something happens to you and then the medical authorities want to take some organs from you, if they do that, it has to be done within minutes. Once the heart stops beating, the organs have to be taken out. That's because this corruption begins to set in. Now, what they can do is they can artificially respirate the body, and you've seen that before. Someone may be brain dead, but the body is still functioning through machines. Now, that's done sometimes to preserve these organs so that they can get to them and then give them to somebody else and save somebody's life. Now, the reason for that is immediately after death, corruption sets in. After a few minutes, without oxygen, the organs deteriorate to the point that they are no longer useful for medical purposes. This is 4 days. We're not talking a few minutes. This is 4 days. We found at verse 39 that Lazarus had gone to the point of being a stench. When you have the stench, then you have the flies. And you have the other things that are being involved there in the body coming. It's reached the point now where it's now going back to the dust. Now, we looked at other resurrections of the Lord. There's 2 in the Scriptures. The daughter of Jairus, we talked about that. A girl who had passed away. Jesus was on his way there. She died. When he got there, he said, "Don't worry, she's not dead, she's sleeping." Everybody ridiculed the Lord. They all knew she was dead. But when you think about it, they had no way to actually test the body. Did the life actually leave? There was no way to test that. So when he raised her from the dead, people could have said, well, maybe she really wasn't dead. The same thing with the widow of Nain, the funeral that Jesus interrupted when he's going into Nain. There's a funeral procession coming out. And there's the corpse being carried. And there's the mourners going. And Jesus stops, touches the corpse, raises the young man from the dead. But once again, the Jews buried the person the same day. So you have a situation, people may say, well, maybe they made a mistake. Maybe he really wasn't dead. But here, there is no possible doubt that a person can have that Lazarus is dead. He stinketh, as the King James says. There is a stench. I think the ESV and the NIV say there is an odor. I prefer not the word odor. Odor is something I think of when I take off my shoes. Stench is the word you think of whenever you come across a dead body. You get that stronger word. That's what we have here. He is definitely dead. There is no possibility that Lazarus was sitting in that tomb waiting for someone to come and wake him up because his body was still functioning. No, it was gone. So we know that. But we look at his return to Bethany in verse 18. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And we talked about that. He's coming back to an area where he was in great danger. The authorities could come and snatch him at any time. He was close enough. And then verse 19. And many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Now here we look at the funeral practices of the Jews. And some of these are still similar today. It says here that many came. We talked about that last week. That this shows that this was a prominent family. We know it was a wealthy family. That first of all, they had their own house, and the house was able to take care of Jesus and probably all his disciples. It was probably large enough for that. And they had, we'll find the next chapter, Mary had this very expensive perfume, this ointment, that she put on the Lord's feet. So you see that this was a prominent and wealthy family. I don't know if you've ever noticed, sometimes someone in the community that's prominent will pass away, and you go by the funeral home and you'll see lines of people going around the funeral home. It was similar to that. People were coming from all over. They're not far from Jerusalem. They probably had influence in Jerusalem, and these people were all coming and comforting. We don't know how many, but I believe before we actually get to the tomb, there may have been well over 100 people or even more around this tomb, considering Jesus was there and considering the prominence of the family. So you think about that. They come and they comfort. The purpose was to comfort Martha and Mary over the loss of their brother. Now the comfort consisted of several things. First of all, there was a 7-day period of mourning. People would stay for 7 days. They would gather around and weep with the mourners as an act of sympathy. A person is mourning a loss, they were mourning with that person. We're to weep with those who weep. So that is a very biblical concept. There were also, however, in this crowd, people that would be considered professional mourners. This is something we have no idea, no concept of in our culture. But either the family or friends of the family would hire people that were really good at crying. They would get the ball rolling. Now the reason I think there's something therapeutic about it, is there's great sorrow, you weep, you sob, you deal with this sorrow, and then there's that afterwards, there's somewhat of a relief that the sorrow is done. And these people would get that sorrow up to a crescendo, because they were professional weepers, mourners. And a lot of these were women that were very good at it. And they would sort of set the atmosphere. Now there would be wailing and sobbing, the whole crowd, for about 7 days. This, of course, would rise to a crescendo, die down, start back up again, and so on. This would go on. And it would begin to lose its intensity, I believe, towards the end of the 7 days. And after these 7 days, there would be another 30 days where, though there's no more official mourning going on, there is the sense that we will be here for you. If you need us, let us know, and we will come back and do whatever's necessary to help you. That went on for 30 days. Now, the Jews had that idea coming way back into the Old Covenant with Jacob. When Jacob died, he died in Egypt. His mourning lasted for 70 days, and this included a 40-day period of embalming. So there's a special type of mourning that went on during that time, a little bit different from what we have here. Moses, when he passed away, there was a 30-day mourning period. It's very similar. Now, back in our grandparents' time, some of you may remember this. In some parts of the country, whenever you lost a loved one, you would wear the black armband. I think it was on the left arm. Now, I've never experienced that. I don't remember any of that. I've seen it in the old movies back in the 40s and 50s. I think it was more popular. They would dress in very dark clothes. They'd wear the black armband. They'd wrap maybe something on the doorknob to symbolize the mourning. So we've kind of lost that because, as I mentioned last week, our culture tries to push death out of the way and forget it. Our forefathers, however, understood it a little bit better, and we had that time of mourning. So you get the idea. when Jesus arrived, there were many of these mourners present, comforting Mary and Martha. Looking then to verse 20, we find the faith of Martha and Mary, starting with Martha. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary was sitting in the house. Now, if you remember the personalities of these two sisters, one was very outgoing, a more of an in-charge type of a person. And Mary was more of a person who liked to sit in the background, was probably an introvert. Martha was the opposite. So you get the picture with these two. Martha was informed probably by a messenger that Jesus was coming. And as soon as she finds out, she went out to meet Jesus. Now, this is what you can expect from her. She is already up and probably taking care of things while Mary is sitting in the house mourning. She's probably up making sure things are in order. She gets the message, and then she goes. Then she makes the statement in verse 21. Now Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Now, we looked at last week that this could have been a scolding of Martha. Remember, Martha actually did scold the Lord back in Luke chapter 10. Whenever Jesus is in the house teaching, the disciples are all gathered around him, and her sister was also sitting at the feet of Jesus and learning as Jesus is teaching. And Martha's out in the kitchen looking, and she's getting upset. "Why aren't I getting any help?" She goes to the Lord, "Lord, tell her to help me." Can you picture telling Jesus? I mean, commanding Jesus? Well, that's her personality. She was a very outgoing. And remember, they're very close to Jesus, a very family type of a situation. Jesus rebukes her for that. That Mary had picked the better of the two. So there's a possibility what she said here could have been a scolding. And when I last week looking into it, I thought that might be the case. But other commentators say there may be another side to that. And what F.F. Bruce says, this is not a complaint. It is an expression of her faith in Jesus' power. It seems to fit better than a complaint. Because notice what she says later. She says, "Now Martha said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.'" And verse 22, "But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." So what is happening here, it doesn't seem to indicate that she believes Jesus is going to raise her brother. Because remember, when Jesus, we'll get to this in a few weeks, when Jesus commands the stone to be rolled away, she's the one that says, "Lord, there's going to be a stench. He's been dead 4 days." If you remember that. So I don't think she had that level of faith. But I think what she is saying here, that even now, even with all that I have gone through and the loss of my brother, even though if you would have been here, he wouldn't have died, even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will do for you. I still believe in you. It's basically probably what she's saying there. And let's take a look at verse 23. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." So Jesus is now prodding into her faith a little bit. He tells her that your brother's going to rise again. Jesus, of course, we know from the context, and we have the advantage of knowing the Scripture, what's going to happen, is referring to the present. But Martha takes this as an eschatological statement, something that's going to happen in the future. "Yes, Lord," she says. Look how she answers him. "I know," verse 24, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. I believe in the resurrection." So she had all her theology correct. She listened, even though she may have been in the kitchen working, she was listening to Jesus, and she was able to get her theology in order. She believed that there was going to be a bodily resurrection. Now, you have to remember, once again, try to put yourself in her shoes. Her brother's been dead. He's been dead for 4 days. He stinks. The body is deteriorated beyond any hope of coming back. And she's sitting there talking to Jesus. She believes in Jesus, but she's still looking at a man with a physical body who appeared like all other Jewish construction workers would appear. So there was great faith in her heart, but the faith, she didn't have quite the faith to believe, or to even understand yet that I'm going to raise him from the dead now, right now. But she does say, "I do believe in this future event." And it is much easier to believe in a future event. You look at the Scriptures, and the Bible very clearly talks about a literal bodily resurrection. There's going to come a day, and the last day, when the resurrection occurs. The just are going to be taken up with new bodies to dwell with the Lord forever. And the unjust are going to be resurrected also with new bodies. But their purpose is to be able to endure the punishment of God's wrath for eternity. So you have this concept of a resurrection. She believed that. And she believed it was coming in the last day. It was a future event. We read some from Daniel. We talked about that. Job 19 talks about that, where he says, I know that my Redeemer liveth. And about his own body, where worms will destroy this body, but in my flesh I will see God. That's in the Old Testament. And in Isaiah 26, verse 19, your dead shall live. Together with my dead body they shall arise. Awake and sing, you who dwell in the dust. For your dew is like the dew of herbs, and the earth shall cast out the dead. So it's not just a New Testament concept. It's also an Old Testament concept, this future resurrection. Martha was familiar with Jesus' teaching. If you just turn back a page or two, maybe a few pages, to chapter 5, and look at verse 21. What was Jesus teaching? 5 and verse 21. For as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. Look to verse 24. Most assuredly I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life, and shall not come into judgment, but is passed from death unto life. Most assuredly I say to you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. And then he goes on. He goes into more detail. So you get the picture that Jesus taught this. She understood this. There was going to be a resurrection. However, Jesus then corrects her. If you take a look back to our text. Jesus said to her, verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. He says, wait a minute, Martha. Yes, there is going to be a resurrection, but you're looking at the resurrection. It's not the event that we're looking at and having faith in that event. We're looking at the person who's involved in that event, the person who controls this event, the Lord Jesus Christ himself. He is the resurrection. So he's getting closer and closer and closer to telling her, I'm doing this now. It's coming right now. And of course, you have to remember, these folks are foggy in their theology. They're dealing still with a man, and they're trying to get that concept. Yes, he's a man, but he's also God. And all these concepts are rolling around in their head. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection. It's not just that there's coming a resurrection that God the Father is going to do, but I am involved in this, and I am the one that's going to call the dead out of their graves. And then he says, I am the life, I am the resurrection and the life. Now, I have life. You have life. He is life. He is the source of life. He looks at a dead body, and because he is the source of life, he's able to put life back into that body. We can't do that. There's life all over the world. That life came from him. Whatever life that you see, the birds, the little insects, whatever else, that life source came from him. That's one reason when you think about it, science is always trying to come up with the idea, what was the origin of life? They think they've got it figured out to a degree that somehow there was a spark, and that spark caused something physical then to animate. I mean, you can take electricity and you can push electricity into something, you can make it jump and move, whatever. Well, that must be life. No, that's not life. That's electricity. If you don't believe me, watch Frankenstein. Okay. They did bring him back to life, didn't they, in that movie? But it doesn't happen for real. Okay, it's all man's fantasy, is thinking, because that doesn't happen. Electricity doesn't equal life. They can't figure it out. Why not? Because it's a spiritual concept. Science is limited. Science cannot get to that point and say yes. And now we understand the source of life, because they don't want to recognize that Jesus Christ is the source of that life. And they'll never, ever be able to comprehend that unless they have him. So that's what he says. I'm the resurrection and the life. And then he says, do you believe this? Well, let me go to verse 25. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Here we have the gospel in a nutshell. Do you believe in the person of Jesus Christ? We're not talking about things that happened to Jesus Christ, they're important also. Do you believe in Him, the person? Do you believe that He is the source of life? Do you believe Him to be the divine Son of God? And that's what he asks. Do you believe this? And this is the necessity of faith. This is what we have to have in our faith, Jesus Christ. And those who deviate from the person of Jesus Christ, and whether they believe that He is not sufficient for your salvation, that you must have other mediators, you must go through Mary, you must go through the saints, that's not the Jesus Christ of the Bible. So if you have faith in that Jesus, and you need to reevaluate that and look at the Jesus of the Bible, He needs no help in His intercession and in His work of salvation. That's the wrong Jesus. Or the Jesus of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who is not even divine. That's not the Jesus that saves. If you have the faith in that kind of a Jesus, then you don't have salvation. But look at Mary's confession of faith. Verse 27. And she said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world." Take note of that. There's three different parts here. First of all, I believe that you're the Christ. You are the promised Messiah of the Old Testament. I believe that you are the Son of God. Remember John 3:16, whoever believes in Him shall not perish. That God sent His only begotten Son, that He is the Son of God. He shares the essence of God. She believes that. And that He has come down from heaven into this world. Remember John chapter 6, where Jesus said, "I am the bread which has come down from heaven." She believed all of that. Now, like the disciples, this faith was weak, as our faith is weak. Her understanding was limited, as our understanding is limited. We have a benefit of having the whole Bible. Remember, they just had the Old Covenant. They had Jesus there with them, but they're trying to comprehend all of this. So her faith was limited and weak. However, it was real. It was genuine. She was an Old Testament saint. Jesus is not yet going to the cross, but she believes in what the Bible teaches about Him. You have Nathanael, if you remember, when we opened the book in chapter 1, where he says, "You are the Son of God, the King of Israel." That was his expression of faith. And Peter, where he says in chapter 6, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now that was true faith in the person of Jesus. Now, he's about to put that faith to the test. Verse 28, we have a change. Now we're going to look at Mary. "And when she had said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary her sister, saying, 'The teacher has come and is calling for you.'" She secretly goes. Now remember, Jesus is still outside the town, and it's believed that He stayed there because had He gone into town, the crowds are already in there at this funeral, at the mourning of Lazarus. He would have had to inject Himself into the crowds, and He would not have the personal interaction with Mary that He could have had, or Martha. So He stayed where He was. She came out to Him. And verse 28, Martha tells her secretly that the teacher has come and is calling for you. So He asked for Mary. As soon as she heard that, verse 9, she arose quickly and came to Him. Now Mary is still sitting in the house. Mary does not have the personality of her sister Martha. She is probably crushed. She's probably unable even to function. She's sitting in the house just weeping. However, when she heard Jesus was there, she got up and she went quickly to Him. However, she's not coming alone. The mourners, now remember, it's their duty to be with those who are mourning and to comfort them. So she gets up and she goes out. And they think, in verse 31, the Jews who were with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary arose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, "She is going to the tomb to weep there." They assumed that, yes, she's weeping, but here, remember, she's just crushed and she's unable to move. All of a sudden she gets up and she's going. She must be going to the tomb. And eventually she will be. So remember, what's happening in all this? These Jews are following her. The crowds are gathering, and Jesus is preparing them for this event. What is going to happen? Something great and unbelievable is going to happen. And these people are all going to be witnesses. So they follow Mary to that place. She comes to Jesus. She falls down before Jesus, and she makes the statement in verse 32, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Now, if you'll notice there, that's all that's said. Jesus does not give her any theological instruction. She's not capable of receiving any instruction at this point. She is inconsolable. She's heartbroken. She's a sobbing woman fallen at his feet, just completely broken up emotionally. Remember, Martha, she was more composed. That was her personality. Mary was completely crushed. So what does Jesus do? We move into the last section. This is the compassion of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now take a look at verse 33. "Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled." Now this word groaned is something, it's a very strong word. The word is used to talk about a very deep emotion, usually of anger. However, this is a different case here. And it literally means to snort like a horse. That's where the word came from. And what it pictures is someone who is so overwhelmed that they are gasping with sob. And that's what Jesus began to do. He is overwhelmed with the sorrow and the weeping that's going on around him, and he's struggling for self-control. Sometimes whenever a person's preaching or teaching, and they're overwhelmed by the teaching, they have to get a hold of themselves, get their composure so they can continue in their teaching. This is where Jesus is. He's lost his composure. He's to the point he's emotionally overcome. He's troubled, it says. He groaned in his spirit and was troubled. His sympathy, this is A.T. Robertson, his sympathy was with the weeping sister, and the wailing crowd caused this deep emotion. It was a troubling emotion. He was overwhelmed. And then verse 34, you see his position, his emotional condition at this point. Verse 34, he says, "Where have you laid him?" Now remember, the crowds are all there now. They followed Mary out. And Jesus says, "Where is he? Where is the grave?" And so the mourners and the sisters say, "Come and see. Lord, come and see." Verse 34, "Follow us to the grave." As they begin going to the grave, we find verse 35. This is the shortest verse in the English Bible. Jesus wept. Now, it's not the shortest verse in the Bible. And I found this out. I wasn't able to look any deeper into it. In the original language, there's actually a shorter verse. Maybe that'll be your homework assignment. Of course, you can Google it now. What's the shortest verse in the original language? And it'll come up. I didn't have time to do that, and I forgot about it. But there is a shorter verse in the original language. But in the English, because there's actually 3 Greek words, I think, there. But in the English, there's just 2. Jesus wept. Now, this shortest verse, however, is given its own verse for a reason. It is a very powerful verse. Now, Jesus is already overcome with emotion. He is trying to keep his composure. But here, what it means literally is he bursts into tears. He begins sobbing and weeping. He is shedding tears of grief too deep for words. Once again, J.C. Ryle says, "Let us remember these things in daily life, and never be ashamed of walking in our Master's footsteps. Let us strive to be men and women of tender heart and a sympathizing spirit. Let us never be ashamed to weep with them that weep and rejoice with them that rejoice." So Jesus, with his friends and with those around him, is overcome by the loss of his friend. However, this weeping goes deeper than what they realize. Take a look at verse 36. "Then the Jews said, 'See how he loved him.'" So they had the idea that Jesus is so overwhelmed because he loved his friend. And it's true. He loved his friend, but it went deeper than that. Because here you have a little taste of the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, Jesus is in the garden, and he is sweating great drops of blood in prayer, what he's going to face as he becomes sin for us he is now confronting the results of sin with Lazarus. He sees the weeping. He sees his friend Lazarus now in the grave and deteriorating physically for 4 days in the stench. And here we have the Son of God come down from heaven where there is no sin, there is no result of sin, and he's overwhelmed by that. Not just the loss of his friend, but the deeper idea that now he's confronted with death and all of its sorrows. Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3, he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And also Hebrews, I didn't get the chapter here, but it says, seeing then that we have a great high priest, I can't remember. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. He endured the same things that we endure. He suffered the same things that we suffered. The loss, the sorrow, the tears, he suffered them just as we did. He is confronted with human sorrow and grief over the results of sin. Then we conclude here with the results, or the conclusion of the crowd, the reaction of the crowd. Verse 37, and some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? Now there could have been well over 100 people involved in this crowd, so the talking was going back and forth at this point. It was Jesus is weeping. They said, basically what they're saying is, what a shame. This man who has done so many miracles and even opened the eyes of the blind, couldn't he have prevented all of this? I mean, surely if he knew all the things that he knows, that he's proven to have known, the things that he's done, we've seen him heal people from a distance, surely he could have prevented this. However, we find that something greater is going to happen. We find him, the next section, which we'll get to possibly next week, but probably not, probably the week after that, where he's at the tomb. We see what happens when the Son of God is confronted with death. You know, I've heard it said before that preachers, they have to be a little bit of an ignorant preacher to do this, but what do I preach on at a funeral? I'll see what Jesus preached on at a funeral. So going through the Bible, going to see. Well, they don't find anything. Because what happens? Every time that the Son of God is confronted with death, death loses. And that's what's going to happen as we find him coming to the grave. And he does the same in the lives of all those that he comes in contact with. All of those whose lives are destroyed by sin. And we're just waiting for that end result. And it's coming. You know, John MacArthur was asked in an interview by Larry King after 9/11. Larry King just said, what does all this mean? And they don't give him the answer. They don't give you questions ahead of time. He said, what it means is that you're going to die and you're not in charge of when or how or whatever. And that's the result of sin. We're all in that point waiting. Jesus does the same thing. Though we may die physically, it's a very short thing. It just takes us from one point to another. Jesus overcomes it. You know, this wasn't the only time that he wept. Let's close looking at verse 19, chapter 19 of Luke. Jesus wept one other time. And the world would do well to listen to this when he weeps. Looking at verse 41, he is coming near Jerusalem of Luke chapter 19. Now as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. Jesus wept over Jerusalem. He had given them the truth time and time and time again. He weeps because he said, you had your opportunity. Your visitation, the day of your visitation has happened. That is when Jesus made himself known to the people. Now, and he does that with individuals as well. He reveals himself to individuals. They see it, and many of them turn from it. And then Jesus weeps as they then go into judgment. Let us bow for prayer.